The high dominion of Australis had once shone brighter than any other empire. Its castles were built from pale stone that caught the light of the twin suns, and its soldiers marched in lines so perfect they looked like parts of a living machine. For many years, Queen Alara ruled over all of it. She sat on a silver throne in the Great Hall, wearing a crown made of crystal, calm and proud. People feared her, and they respected her. None dared to speak to her without bowing first. But all great things eventually begin to break. A storm quietly grew against the power of Australis. At first there were whispers. Some small kingdoms refused to send taxes. A few officers spoke of freedom. Then the whispers turned into acts of open rebellion. Soldiers loyal to the queen vanished. Couriers stopped returning. Soon the edges of her empire were filled with rebel flags, and the night skies shone with fires from burning cities. Queen Alara did not panic. She had never been afraid of war. She had been born into it, trained from girlhood to rule through strength.
Ow.
She believed that she could crush this rebellion like she had crushed all others. But time began to turn against her. Her generals failed. Her closest advisor betrayed her. Entire legions disappeared in battles she never saw. When her main palace fell, she refused to surrender. She escaped into the mountains to her last fortress called Corinthia. It was built on a high ridge, carved into rock and guarded by walls so thick that no one believed they could be broken. Those who managed to escape with her were her most loyal guards and a few counselors. The rest of her empire was lost. Winter came early that year. Snow covered the mountains like a white blanket hiding a wounded world. Inside the fortress, its torches flickered low, and the queen walked slowly through empty halls that still smelled of smoke and dust. She felt the silence pressing around her. Once, people had filled these rooms with laughter and music. Now there were only footsteps on cold stone and the distant sound of wind. Her thoughts became heavy, and the old stories began to haunt her mind. When she had been a young girl, her mother used to tell her tales of the past. Among those tales was the story of the human champions. Men and women from a faraway world who fought not for power, but for honor and truth. They were said to be people who never bowed to fear, who never ruled others through cruelty. The stories described them as bright spirits that came when darkness and greed filled the world. Alara had never believed them. She thought those were bedtime tales made to comfort children. In her world, only power could protect anyone. She carried that belief through her rise to the throne, through every war she fought, and even now, while her empire broke apart. But sometimes when the night grew still and she sat alone in her chamber, she wondered what would happen if a single person like that, someone pure in heart, not hungry for control, could truly exist. Outside her fortress, the valley burned. The enemy surrounded Corinthia, waiting for her to yield. Every morning, her messengers brought news of defeat. Every night, she crossed another name off the long list of commanders who had died trying to defend her realm. One morning, as the first light touched the frozen peaks, the queen stood on her balcony and looked down toward the plain. Through the mist came a figure walking alone across the snow, leaving a single line of footprints. There were no banners, no soldiers behind him, no armor shining on his body, just a man, steady and upright, moving closer with each step. The guards on the walls shouted and raised their weapons, shouting warnings, ready to fire. But the man did not run. He did not even look afraid. When they brought him before the queen, his clothes were torn and his boots were covered in dust. His eyes were tired, but calm.
Oh.
Queen Alara stared at him in silence. He bowed his head slightly, a gesture of respect but not submission. He looked like no warrior she had ever seen. The guards whispered among themselves. They thought him mad to walk alone into the fortress of a fallen queen. "Who are you?" Alara asked. Her voice was sharp, almost threatening. "My name is Daniel Cole," the man said quietly. "I came through the fire to find the one who still stands." Alara frowned. "There is nothing left to find here, only ashes." "Even ashes can hold the spark," he said simply. Something about his tone stopped her from ordering his death. Her counselors urged her to send him away, but she felt an old chill move through her, like the memory of a childhood dream. That strange calm in his eyes reminded her of those ancient stories she had long dismissed. For the first time in years, Queen Alara felt something different from fear or pride. She felt curiosity. Daniel Cole sat quietly on the cold floor of a stone cell. The room was small, lit only by a torch burning outside the iron bars. He was tired from the long walk and the sharp climb through the snowy valley. His hands were rough, his clothes torn, and his face carried the tired look of a man who had seen too many battles. Still, he did not complain. He sat with his back straight, breathing slowly, waiting. In another part of the fortress, Queen Alara stood by the great window of her chamber. She had not stopped thinking about the stranger since the morning. Her advisors warned her that he could be a spy, a trick sent by the rebels. But something deep inside her told her there was more to him. He had no army, no weapon, except his will. There was calm strength in his voice when he spoke to her. It was not the kind of strength that came from rank or pride. It was the kind that came from truth. She ordered that he be brought before her again. The guards led Daniel into the great hall, where the throne stood at the far end. The hall was quiet. Only the sound of dripping water and the slow breathing of torches filled the space. Daniel looked around. The walls were marked by cracks, and the banners of Astralis hung like faded memories. When Alara appeared, she walked with her usual grace, but her eyes looked tired. She studied Daniel carefully for a moment before speaking. "You came through the fire," she said, "and through death. Why did you come?" Daniel lifted his eyes to her. "To stop the war," he said simply. "To stop what destroys everything." The queen's lips curved into a faint smile that did not reach her eyes. "Do you think one man can stop a war?" "One always starts it," he answered. "So one can end it." The hall fell silent. The guards exchanged puzzled looks. No one had ever spoken to the queen in that way, not with arrogance, but with a certain unshaken honesty. Alara leaned back on her throne and studied him again. "You speak as if the stories are real," she said. "Like those old legends of heroes that could not die." "I am no hero," Daniel said. "Just someone who remembers what it means to protect instead of destroy." His words were simple, yet they carried weight. Alara felt them linger in the air long after he finished speaking. She could not remember the last time someone had spoken to her without fear. "Tell me," she said. "Do you know what it means to rule a broken empire?" "I know what it means to lose one," he replied. His voice grew softer. "AB, it is not just your empire that is broken. AB, it is all of us." The queen lowered her eyes for a moment. Those words touched something she had hidden away for years. The silence between them grew warm, not heavy. For the first time in many days, she felt she was not standing on the edge of hopelessness. Against the advice of her counselors, she ordered the guards to release him from the cell and treat him as a guest. The officers objected, but she gave them a single look that silenced them. Daniel was given a small room near the western wall of the fortress and food that had not been cooked in weeks for anyone but her. Later that night, as the storm howled outside, Alara went to the training hall. It was a wide space with high ceilings and broken mirrors. Once, she had trained there with her captains when she was younger. Memories came back to her in flashes. The sound of swords, the scent of sweat and metal, laughter that had long vanished. She stood there in silence until she heard footsteps. Daniel entered quietly, his shadow stretching long across the floor. "You still believe you can stop a war?" she said, not turning around. "I believe I can try," he said. She turned to face him. "Then show me what you can do." She picked up 2 wooden practice swords and threw one to him. Daniel caught it easily. The queen attacked first, her movements sharp and fast, but Daniel moved with surprising precision. He stepped aside from each strike, reading her rhythm as if he had known her style all his life. There was no anger in his fight, only focus. The noise echoed through the empty chamber. When she finally struck too quickly, Daniel turned his wrist, disarming her in one clean motion. The wooden sword flew across the floor and landed near the wall. She stood still, breathing slowly, then smiled faintly. "You are different," she said softly. "I've had enough of battles that end in death," Daniel said. "I learned that the hardest fight is the one to keep people alive." Alara said nothing. The storm outside grew louder, and for the first time in a long time, she felt something break inside her, not pride, but a wall she had built around her heart. When he bowed slightly and began to leave, her voice stopped him. "Tell me, Daniel," she asked quietly, "do you believe a ruler can change?" He looked back at her, his face calm in the dim light. "Anyone can change," he said. "But someone has to want to." As he walked into the dark corridor, Alara stood alone in the quiet hall. The echo of his words stayed with her long after he was gone. And she felt for the first time that perhaps the stories were not just tales after all. The morning after their fight in the training hall, the air around the fortress felt strangely lighter. For weeks the soldiers had walked with bowed heads, their eyes sunken from fear and exhaustion. That day they noticed their queen walking among them without guards. Her steps were no longer sharp and cold. She stopped to look out at the valley where smoke still rose from the villages below. It was as if her mind had started to see the world in new colors. Daniel had begun to help wherever he could. He fixed broken armor with the skill of someone used to working with his hands. He taught the young soldiers how to move quietly, how to think before fighting, how to survive when all hope seemed lost. Many of them looked at him with amazement. It was not his strength that impressed them, but the quiet way he spoke, like each word carried the weight of a promise. Queen Alara watched him from the upper balcony one afternoon as he trained the soldiers. Unlike her commanders, Daniel did not shout or demand respect. He asked questions, listened to answers, and gave advice only when needed. Men who had almost lost their will to fight began to stand straighter, to believe again. His calm confidence spread through the fortress like a warm fire through cold stone. That evening, Alara called for him again. He arrived with his usual calmness, bowing his head slightly. She studied his face in the light of the flames from the fireplace. "You have given my men purpose again," she said. "They begin to smile when they speak of you. Even their fear has changed shape." Daniel looked into the fire and replied, "Sometimes fear can be turned into strength if someone believes there is still something worth fighting for." Alara nodded softly. "But what is there to fight for when everything is broken?" His answer came after a moment. "You fight for what can still be made right." That simple line stayed in her mind long after he left. That night, she slept little. She walked through the long corridors of the castle, past ruined banners and empty halls. Memories moved through her like ghosts. She remembered every order she had given that brought pain, every battle fought for glory rather than justice. The crown on her head suddenly felt heavy, as if its weight carried all her mistakes. The next day, she decided to face the truth hidden behind her pride. She went out to the courtyard where her people had gathered. There were wounded soldiers, servants, and families who had lost loved ones. They had gathered around the fires, looking cold and hungry. Alara walked among them without her crown. Many bowed in surprise, unsure how to behave around their queen in such a simple form. A small boy came forward, offering her a piece of stale bread. His hands were shaking. She knelt to take it from him, and when she did, the crowd fell silent. For years they had seen her from a distance, untouchable, distant like a moon in the sky. Now she was among them. She took the bread and smiled lightly at the boy. "Thank you," she said softly. Daniel watched the scene from afar. He could see how the soldiers stood taller when their queen bent down to help the weak. He had seen many rulers before her, men and women who wanted power only for themselves, but Alara was beginning to change. He could see the light of thought behind her eyes. The slow awakening of someone who had finally begun to understand compassion. Later that night, rain began to fall, washing the ash from the fortress walls. Daniel stood outside in the rain, looking toward the dark hills where the enemy's fires still glowed faintly. He heard soft footsteps behind him. When he turned, Alara was there, her hair damp, her eyes reflecting the soft light of the torches. "They will attack soon," she said quietly. "No," Daniel replied. "Do you think we can win?" He looked at her for a long moment. "Winning takes many forms. Sometimes victory is not about who holds the sword, but about who holds the truth." Her eyes studied him carefully. "And what is your truth, Daniel?" "That people are not meant to destroy what they love," he said. "War ends when one person chooses to stop fighting out of hate." The rain grew heavier, falling in soft patterns against the stone walls. Lara felt both sorrow and courage rise inside her. She realized that he was not here to save her throne, he was here to save her humanity. And for the first time, she wanted to be saved not as a queen, but as a person who still believed there was goodness left in the world. When Daniel finally returned to his room that night, Alara stayed in the courtyard alone. She tilted her face toward the sky and let the rain fall on her skin. Her crown still rested in her chamber, untouched. It no longer felt like protection. It felt like a cage. In the quiet beating of the rain, she understood that change had already begun. Something new had entered her world, something that no army could command, no weapon could destroy. It was hope. A single man had brought it back into her life, and she could not turn away from it. Far away in the dark, the enemy forces were preparing to strike, but inside Corinthia Fortress, for the first time in many long years, a tiny light of peace flickered in the heart of a queen. The next morning came with a heavy fog wrapping the mountains. The fortress of Corinthia looked like an island floating above the white mist. The soldiers moved quietly, their breath turning into small clouds in the cold air. Queen Alara stood on the high wall beside Daniel, watching the gray valley below. The fires of the enemy still burned in the distance like dull red stars. For days now, rumors had spread through the fortress. Some said the enemy was preparing for one last attack. Others said the enemy had already grown tired and would soon retreat. Alara listened to all of them, but believed none. She had learned not to depend on hope that stood only on words. She turned to Daniel. "They will come soon," she said. Daniel stared across the valley silently.
Yes.
"But fear will not help us meet them." Alara watched him for a moment. "You always speak of calm," she said. "How can you stand so still when death is near?" "I was born in a world that knows war," Daniel said. "You learn to fight because you must, but you live because you choose to. Every battle reminds you that fear ends only when you face it." Alara nodded slowly. "I have faced fear all my life, yet it never left me." "Maybe because you fought it alone," Daniel said. His gaze met hers, warm and steady. "No ruler stands forever without someone beside them." Those words stayed in her heart, even when she turned away. Later that day, she gathered her commanders in the council chamber. The room was dim, the air thick with doubt. Maps covered the wooden table. Many of the officers were worn, their uniforms torn, faces lined with worry. They all rose when Alara entered, but she waved them down gently. "I called you here not to plan another war," she said, "but to end one." The men exchanged looks of surprise. One of them, an old captain with a scar on his cheek, spoke carefully. "My queen, the rebels will not stop. They want your surrender." "Then let them see something stronger than surrender," she said. "Let them see choice." No one quite understood her meaning, but her eyes told them not to press further. She had already chosen her path. That evening, she asked Daniel to walk with her through the lower halls. The corridors were quiet, the walls lined with fading paintings of old kings and queens. Soldiers watched them pass in silence. When they reached the old courtyard, the moonlight spilled across the stones. "I have been thinking," she said at last. "If I die tomorrow, this war will end in chaos. But if I live only to protect my power, there will never be peace." "What do you think I should do?" Daniel looked up at the moon before answering. "Do what feels right, not what feels safe." She smiled faintly. "Make it sound simple?" "Truth often is," Daniel said, looking at her directly. "It is the heart that complicates it." They stood there a long time without speaking. The wind carried the chill of coming battle, but it no longer frightened her. In that silence, she realized something deeper than loyalty had grown between them. She respected his strength, but more than that, she trusted him not as a soldier, not even as a guide, but as a friend. When dawn came, the enemy army appeared on the lower slopes of the valley. Their torches burned bright in the fog. The sound of drums echoed like thunder. Every man and woman within Corinthia could hear it. Inside the fortress, Daniel moved among the men, giving simple instructions, reminding them to stay calm, to watch and wait. His calmness spread again, like quiet fire through the ranks. Even those who had planned to desert stood their ground. Alara watched all of this from the wall. She felt the strange peace that comes before a storm. Then she turned to Daniel, who now stood beside her once more. "I have decided something," she said. "There will be no needless death today." He looked at her with quiet respect. "Whatever you plan, I will stand by you." She smiled, tired but sure, "and stand beside me when I face them." When the rebel forces reached the foot of the fortress, the gates opened not with battle cries but with silence. The queen stepped forward first, wearing no crown and no armor, only a plain cloak. Daniel walked beside her. The soldiers on both sides lowered their weapons, unsure what to do. The leader of the rebels, a tall man with rough eyes, stepped forward. "So the great queen finally gives up," he said loudly. Alara's voice was calm but strong. "No, I do not give up. I choose peace. The war ends today, with or without your will." The man laughed. But the sound faded when he saw how steady her eyes were. Behind her, Daniel's presence stood like quiet steel, not threatening, but unbroken. Her words began to spread through both armies, carried by the still air. Soldiers began to whisper. Some even dropped their weapons. It was as if the spell of hate had cracked. The rebel leader raised his sword, but before he could speak, many of his men stepped back, no longer wanting to fight a queen who had chosen mercy over blood. That was the moment Alara knew something had changed forever. The war was not yet over, but she could already see a new dawn forming at the edge of the gray sky. Standing beside her, quiet as the steady earth, was Daniel, proof that legends did not have to be born from myths, but from the hearts of those who still believed in doing what was right. The first light of morning touched the mountains like golden paint over stone. The valley below Corinthia was still, covered with mist that hid both sides of the battle that never came. The soldiers who had stood ready to fight now sat in quiet groups, waiting but not moving. No one wanted to break the strange peace that had settled. Queen Alara stood on the wall looking down. Her cloak was damp from the mountain air, and her hair moved lightly in the wind. She could still see the faces of those who had once been her enemies standing with lowered weapons. No one had expected it, not even her. Peace felt fragile, like glass that could shatter with one loud word. Yet it was there, real and shining, and she could feel it in her chest. Daniel came to stand beside her. He looked tired but calm, his eyes carrying the same steady warmth that had never left him even in danger. "It is done," he said softly. "Not yet," she replied. "Peace begins only when people believe it can last." He nodded slowly. "Then give them something to believe in." The queen turned to him with a faint, tired smile. "Make it sound easy. But belief is harder than war." "True," Daniel said. "But it is worth more." They walked down the main steps together. Below, her soldiers stood facing the rebel fighters. Between them stretched a quiet, uneasy space. The air smelled of smoke, cold stone, and the wetness of earth after long rain. Alara stepped into that space. Everyone watched her. Her voice was low but clear. "The war is over," she said. "No more children will grow up with hate in their hearts. No more soldiers will die for the pride of rulers. The land is bled enough." The rebel leader, the same man who had shouted at her the night before, came forward slowly. His sword hung at his side, but no longer in anger. "And if the peace fails," he asked. "Then we build it again," said Alara, "as many times as it takes." Her tone held not command but promise. The man looked at her for a long moment, then dropped his sword into the mud. One by one, others began to follow. First the rebels, then her own men. The sound of steel meeting earth filled the valley like a lonely song. Daniel watched her as she stood there, surrounded by people who had once sworn to destroy each other. He had seen many wars end before, but never like this. She had laid down her pride and won something no army could ever claim so completely: the will of her people. Later, when the crowds began to move back toward the fields, Alara walked quietly through them. Some reached out their hands to touch her sleeve as she passed. Others whispered her name not in fear, but with respect. The change in their eyes told her everything she needed to know. By evening, the fires of war had gone out. Instead, small cooking fires burned among groups of soldiers who no longer cared which side they had belonged to. Food was shared, stories were told, and real laughter rose into the cold night. Alara and Daniel sat on a low wall watching them. The queen looked at her people, her eyes full of wonder. "Do you think they will remember this day?" she asked. "Yes," Daniel said. "They will tell it differently, perhaps. Some will call it luck, some will call it fate. But they will remember that peace came when courage looked like mercy, not power." She turned to him with a small smile. "You speak like a man who has seen both worlds." "I have," he said softly. "One that forgot how to hope, and one that learned again." They sat in silence for a long time, the firelight flickering on their faces. Soon, the queen rose. "Owe you more than I can ever repay," she said. "You owe me nothing," Daniel replied. You found your own strength. I only reminded you it was there. Her eyes softened. Still, you changed everything. He gave a quiet laugh. Maybe everything just needed a little push. The next morning, when the first light touched the gates of Corinthia, Daniel was gone. The guards said they had seen him walking down the mountain path at dawn, leaving only a small bundle behind. A simple metal pendant, shaped like a broken circle. Alara found it by the courtyard wall, resting where he had last stood. She held it in her hands for a long time before placing it on the table beside her throne. The hall felt different now, not as a place of command, but as a space where choices could begin again. As days turned into weeks, the fortress filled with builders instead of warriors. The people of Astralis returned to their homes. Cry of battle was replaced by the sound of hammers shaping a new world. Every evening, the queen walked to the balcony and looked over the valley. She thought of the man who had come from nowhere with no army, no crown, just a quiet heart strong enough to change her own. Some said he was a ghost. Others said he was a legend reborn. But Alara knew the truth. He was only human, a man who believed that courage without kindness was hollow. And so in her royal books, when the scribes asked how they should record the end of the war, Issy told them simply, the queen once believed that human champions were only stories. Until one stood before her and reminded her what it meant to be human again.